And welcome back, listeners and viewers, to another episode of the Unbreakable Podcast. Today, I am delighted to have Dr. Ty McKinney here with me today, also known as Ty the Neuro Guy. How's it going, Ty?
It's going pretty good. It's a bright, sunny day, and the week had some good accomplishments and some wins. So overall, I feel like we're starting off 2026 on a really good note.
I love that. I love that. So let's give our listeners a little bit of background about who you are and what you do and where your passion lies.
Yeah. So if I recall correctly, your audience is global. So I was born, raised in small town Alberta, Canada. So I like to joke that culturally, my small town is about 10 years, a decade behind the rest of the country in that sense. So kind of grew up a little bit behind the eight ball that way. And when I got to college, I really became very passionate about understanding how does the brain work and how could we potentially use this understanding, this research, this insight in order to promote health and wellness in different ways. Um, and then uh, more or less, I realized there's a really big gap when it comes to psychological assessment and technology, where
Mm.
for the most part, when we're trying to understand mental health challenges that people are going through, we're still using technology from World War II, aka pen and paper. Uh, so I specifically wanted to focus research on how we could use more advanced forms of technology, which is really almost anything, but specifically brain waves, in trying to do a better job of that assessment process. Um, so that brought me down to the University of Utah for my PhD. And a couple years in, it became apparent that I was not the best therapist, but I really enjoyed the assessment side. So I switched into a purely research-based program. So I didn't do any more clinical training, but then I got to really focus on the technology side. And it became apparent that maybe brainwave recordings are not the best technology that we should be leveraging at this point in time, and instead we switched towards a data that we could collect through the internet, um, and all the benefits that that potentially could bring. Uh, and then just as I was getting ready to graduate is when the pandemic started, and just there was a crazy constellation where it made sense for me to start a company related to trying to commercialize some of these research approaches. And initially, we tried to pursue a corporate wellness as the strategy for how to do that commercialization, specifically burnout management as it
Mm.
relates to neurodiversity. Um, and then in the few years since then, we've realized there's actually a bigger gap in the addiction recovery space in terms of how do we measure those outcomes in a way that is scientifically valid, and in a way that different parties can have trust in. And overall, how can we be more thoughtful and smart in how we're making recommendations for resources and funding and programming, so that people are getting the support that they need, not just the support that happens to be available and funded in different ways. So that's kind of a very long-winded explanation for how I went from a bright-eyed, bushy-eyed prairie boy to running a tech company focused on health, wellness, and innovation.
That's incredible. What do you find? What surprised you the most when you went from, okay, I'm not a really great therapist to I'm going to look at down the pathways. Like when you tease everything apart, what is the one area that surprises you?
I think there's two things that surprise me. So the first one is just the reluctance and resistance to change that is present within our various institutions. So for example, I was interested in basically pairing brainwave recordings with psychological assessment as is typically done. And all of my clinical advisors, those types of people, more or less said that's a bad idea. Don't do it. It's not going to work. There's all these reasons why it can't work. And there's been echoes of that mentality in different areas. Again, it almost seems like the larger the organization is, whether it's public or private, or profit or nonprofit, the the more reluctance they have to actually changing things if it's apparent that there could be a problem. And I guess the other thing that really surprised me is specifically here in Alberta, we've really got this let's just get her done kind of mentality. And that, but at the same time, we're, very, we like to balance work and play in a number of different ways. So I find like there's a very unique combination of economic and cultural factors here in Alberta, where we want to do a better job, in terms of business and economics, but we also want to do a better job socially, and we're trying to find that balance. And I think that there's a lot of places around the world where that balance isn't really obtained. It's kind of skewed one way or the other. It's either, taking care of people, but not necessarily worrying about the finance, the business cases as well. Or it's, very, uh, it's all about trying to maximize the ROI and the individual gets left out of that equation. Whereas I find in Alberta, we're really trying to balance that equation in a way that I haven't seen present in other areas.
Do you think that's because of our social landscape and our political landscape?
I think that's definitely a large component of it. Like, I mean, if you look at a lot of the people that have come to live in Alberta over the last, 50, 100 years, for the most part, it's farmers and entrepreneurs and people that, for whatever reason, didn't like the opportunities presented either in Europe or on the East Coast of, Canada, USA, and they wanted to try it out in the Wild West. And it's a very rugged climate. If anyone hasn't heard of Alberta winter, eh, we do often sometimes make the coldest place on earth in any given year. So it takes a lot of resilience, I think, to kind of manage those climate conditions. But then you pair that all together, and you just get a population of people that I like to joke that in Calgary, we don't care about your sexual identity status as long as you pay your invoices on time.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. But it's so interesting because you look at the difference between like Calgary and Edmonton, for example, right?
Yes,
And
one hundred
they're
percent.
quite different, right?
Yeah, no, I lived for 3 years in Edmonton, and I grew up kind of peripheral to that city, so I'm very familiar with it. Um, and I like to think about Edmonton as like the hippie, like anarchist, like haven in Alberta, where it's like if for some reason the mainstream, whatever isn't working for you, there's a higher than chance likelihood you'll end up at Edmonton. You can find a community there. So as a result, there's a lot of like social reform push. Like you see a lot more people kind of wearing like, like punky kinds of like styles. I've noticed like alternative rock seems to, thrive a little bit more in Edmonton. So it's really got that kind of counterculture mentality. Whereas Calgary, because we're the corporate headquarters of the province, again, it's almost like we're trying not to get into those issues intentionally because we're trying to make business happen. But at the same time, we want to be authentic in the way that we do business. So there is quite a bit of a difference, even just between the two major cities within Alberta. And that rural versus urban divide, I find is present in other areas, but for some reason in
Mhm.
Calgary, we find a way to bridge it just a little bit more respectfully. Well, really focus on trying to make sure that everyone's included in getting our outcomes.
Well, I also think that innovation, not to suggest that Edmonton doesn't have innovation, but I think that Calgary is an innovation hub. Like when we look at things like technology and we look at things like um, even in business, in reforming business and moving things forward, a lot of that lives in the Calgary area. Whereas I do see that the social side of our province, the heartbeat, if you would, lives kind of where the government lives. And you look at some of the things that went through with the education system in 2025, right, where you saw two very significant periods of time where educators or educational assistants were out picketing and really being very vocal about what their needs and their wants were to the province and their union. I think that a lot of that really came out of Edmonton and that the communities surrounding the Edmonton area. It didn't feel as prevalent to me in the Calgary area.
No, well, 100%. I think there's a lot of truth to what you were saying there. And I think that it's important to recognize that there are multiple different ways that you can protest policy, legislation, what have you, that you don't like. I've often made the joke that if the French are protesting something, you should probably pay attention because the rest of the world is
Yes.
probably going to protest about it in the next up and coming years. I mean, in the same way, when in a similar manner, when Edmonton is protesting something, it's usually that sentiment is felt elsewhere. Just people are potentially not protesting in the same way. um, and again, like how you actually achieve your objectives in that regard, I think is really important. But going back to the one piece that you were saying about innovation and how Calgary is in many ways like the hub for innovation. um, I find that a really interesting comment because, like, in my opinion, technology and innovation is so um, a- ambiguous and ill-defined, almost by its nature, that it doesn't that it's hard to kind of put a pin down on it because every area has some opportunity for innovation and technology development. It's just a question of what are the resources and what's the culture available in
Mm,
order to drive that. So you're right. Calgary does have overall a bigger technology and innovation sector. And it's a lot of B2B style companies where it's, companies supporting other companies rather than oftentimes we think like tech companies, we think like Meta and Google and stuff like that, where it's, supporting individual people. Whereas Edmonton does have a tech sector, but interestingly, it's got a little bit more of a focus on social impact. So, like, if you look at
mhm.
different grant funding opportunities, the companies that tend to come out, Edmonton has a lot more of a focus on making sure that everyone is included in the pie when it gets cut up. Whereas I would say Calgary is slightly more focused on how do we make the industrial pie bigger. So they both have tech sectors, but they've got slightly different focuses based on kind of their different cultural and I guess geopolitical backgrounds.
That makes sense. And I think it kind of is in alignment with what we were just talking about as well when you look at it kind of as the blue collar, white collar. So kind of taking on that thread and giving it a little bit of a tug. Let's move a little bit more into that neurology and the resilience space because when we think about the work that we do through Unbreakable, it really is about creating a greater sense of resilience in people. And so let's pull on the thread of, it's going out and organizing and protesting or raising your voice or lending your voice to a cause, right? That is an emotional pull, right? And it's something that lights up in your body. And I'm sure that you see this a lot. Like I've actually stopped watching the news or even reading the news because I find that my amygdala lights up pretty heavy and I become really volatile very quickly. And just because it's the things that I read and the things that I see aren't in alignment with my value system of how I choose to see myself in the world and how I choose to treat other people, right? Like I wake up in the morning and I write in my journal, I am love. Everything I want to do. I can do hard stuff. I can have difficult conversations. I can provide hard feedback. I can redirect somebody. I can tell somebody that I don't want their attention, whatever that is, and I can still be very kind about it. I don't need to be cruel, nasty, mean, or unreasonable, right? When we think about the work that you do, and now sitting back and looking at our geopolitical world right now, what are some of the things that you as kind of a neurologist you look at and you go, okay, well, if that's something that annoys me, I would do this? Or like how do you regulate yourself in order to be able to kind of exist in this current state?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I like that you started off by saying that you intentionally take breaks from the media and you're very thoughtful about the information that you consume and digest. Basically, I had to learn how to do that as well. So when I was down in Salt Lake City doing my PhD, that was during the first Trump presidency. Um, and Salt Lake is very similar to Edmonton in the sense that like it's very much so like a progressive left leaning kind of bubble in a broader they call it a red state, but a broader like conservative jurisdiction. So that rural versus urban tension is very present. You can feel it. And then additionally in Salt Lake, you have the Latter Day Saints Church and the anti Latter Day Saints Church, Mormon, anti Mormon, might be more familiar with tension as well, because there's a lot of ex Mormons that live in Salt Lake. So as a result, there's many different layers of tension there, and Trump just made all of it worse in the sense like you just that gap got way bigger.
Yeah.
And I think it was a year or two into the first Trump presidency, I realized like I just need to stop paying attention to American media. It's like not good for me. It's alarmist. Every day I was just hearing about the world being on fire. All my colleagues seemed like they were really engaged with this discourse of what is the horrible thing that Trump is doing today. And as a
Yeah.
Canadian, I'm like, well, this is technically not my, horse and pony show. Unfortunately, that does have impact towards me, so you have to care just a little bit. But that was when I first really became much more thoughtful about the information that I was consuming. And truth be told, I just honestly started getting my news more from Canadian journalism, just because it was a little less extreme at the other side than a lot of the American media at the time was. So again, it got me thinking about how to just be very mindful about the information that I'm getting, who I'm getting it from, and who are the people that I have in my life that are kind of in that same vicinity. So if you have, there's often the um, a phrase that I've heard, you are the average of your five people that you spend the most time with. And I think that's definitely true. So making sure that I intentionally try to curate, my inner circle, so to speak, like those are people that, I've got that alignment and value, that alignment and work ethic. And that critically that alignment and optimism and that desire to get things done. Whereas if you get a lot of people that are just constantly in that survival state, and that they're not being as mindful about where they're getting their information from, then that can have negative impacts on you. So yeah, just being very careful about at the first layer is kind of the information that you're engaging with and the people that you're engaging with, so that way you actually feel like you have a voice and actions that matter.
I think that's a really important component is, curating the experience that you want, right? Like, I think that that's really important. What's interesting to me is it's a piece of work that I'm working on right now. A lot of research has gone into it. And it's one of the hot topics that people want to talk about. And that is the multi-generational workforce. And frankly, I mean, just the multi-generational world that we're living in. People are living longer than they ever have because of modern medicine, all of those different things, right? So when you look across the landscape, you have, our traditionalists, our silent generation, then we have our boomers, then you have this little micro generation that is Gen Jones, 1 foot in boomer, 1 foot in Gen X, then you have your Gen X, then you have zillennials, that's us, yay zillennials. We've got 1 foot Gen X, 1 foot millennial, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, Gen Beta. So you look at this landscape, and so our betas are really little right now. They're not consuming things actively on their own. But our alphas, all the way to our silent and our boomers, are consuming, right? And so, you're talking about being able to curate the people that you want to be around, curate the information that you want to have. And I use these examples quite frequently. My daughter's Gen Z, fabulous. They're one of my favorite generations. A lot of people are, they've got a lot to say about Gen Z. They're lazy. They're this. They're that. I see it differently, right? But I also choose to engage with them in the way that they want to be engaged, as opposed to engaging with the way that my boomer father would have just said, "Do as I say, not as I do. Children should be seen and not heard," right? So when we
Yeah.
look at the landscape of where people get their information from and how we curate our family relationships and our dynamics, I think that there's a lot to be said there, because Gen Z gets a lot of their information from social media. Like, my daughter sends me TikTok to share her news stories with me. That's where she gets all of her news, is TikTok. And it is, you want to talk about curated sensationalism? Like, that is,
Yeah.
that's CNN and Fox News on 6 different types of steroids, right?
Yes.
So she'll send me a TikTok, and I'll send her a Wall Street Journal article. And I think we're both very well aware that she doesn't read the articles and I don't watch the TikToks. The point is that we're having the conversation. But then let's
Yeah.
sprinkle in a little bit of boomer in there. My mother-in-law, so we were out for Christmas, and as we're out for Christmas, My mother-in-law, she's like a narcoleptic. She just like falls asleep. Like she'll be watching TV and it's like you go in there and she's asleep. Well, she puts YouTube on one night, and the things that she likes to watch on YouTube on her TV are all about, because she's Ukrainian descent, are all about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. And they're not good. It's like the dissection of what the Russians are doing and this, that, and the other thing. Well, she's got a blanket in her chair pulled up to here, and the remote control is under the blanket in her hand, and she's passed out. And I don't know how to turn her TV off. Like I'm sitting there, like, doing this down the side of the TV.
Yeah.
And the things that she listens to and falls asleep to are astounding to me. Like, I'm like, how does that infiltrate your dreams? How does that make you feel when you wake up in the morning? Right? Like, I digitally detox at the end of every day. I took my phone and I plug it in at a certain hour, and I don't look at it again until the next day after I've woken up and done my process. Right? So
Yeah.
when we think about those communication norms and the curated social media and the meonomy and the targeted socials that we have based off of algorithm, and then the desire to know more, like it becomes an addiction to the brain to
Yeah.
get that kind of information, right?
No, no, I completely agree. And I guess coming back to the original root, when you're saying that in relation to like an intergenerational workforces and some of those challenges, um, I think it's important to recognize that for much of human history, we've kind of been pushed into a bit of a survival mode. And depending on what technologies and, cultural zeitgeist and those sorts of things have been in vogue in different points in history, that informs how people try to manage or navigate that sense of survival. Like if you think about the
Mm.
concept of intergenerational trauma, the vast majority of families in Canada that have been here for a generation or two are just getting over the intergenerational trauma of World War II. Because again, if you think about the challenges that were associated with that, and then that influences how they raise their children, which I think for the most part be the baby boomers era. And you were commenting on how some of those parenting techniques may not be the most kind and scientifically validated. So then you get the reactions to that, and now you have Gen Alpha at the bottom end. Um, who is a reaction to the way that Gen X and Millennial has been doing some of their approaches. So when you kind of take a step back and you recognize that we're all just trying to heal, we're all trying to get out of survival mode and into a place of safety and thriving. It's really just a question of how are people choosing to navigate that, or whether or not there's an active choice. Because you're very correct in that what I think is really challenging right now is that social media makes it very difficult to have an active choice. Like, I appreciate the digital detox that you do. I try to do the same thing. And I noticed that I think it was about 6 months ago, when I tried to be a lot more thoughtful and conscientious about my own personal fitness. I was able to start getting more like suggestions on Instagram and those sorts of sites related to fitness related content. So you do have some degree of agency in what kind of information you get to consume, but you have to be
Mm.
mindful and thoughtful about the systems that you're operating in, and how what you would like to do may not work for other people for any number of reasons, whether it's generational, whether it's cultural, whether it's gender based, or or what have you. But as long as we can all have a good conversation about, hey, let's not stay in survival mode, let's find ways to at least psychologically make that transition over to a cognitive abundance, then we can start making much more progress. But how you go from survival to abundance is going to be different for individual people. And by extension, it'll be different for different organizations when you scale up to the business level.
You're right. And I think the contrary part to that is also looking at it from, even just like the cultural perspective, country to country. So I work for an American company. And I'm very grateful for everything that they provide to our family and the opportunities they provide to me. It was a very, very good move for me to go to that organization. But what's interesting to me is they believe that because we share a border, that we're just very much the same. And in fact, we're
Yeah.
not. I mean, Canada has a very distinct culture to it, and we have a distinct language. Like we have a lot of different things that make us very unique in the global landscape.
Well, 100%. We value compromise way more than many other cultures.
Mhm. An invitation. Yeah, I think that's the
Mhm.
one thing that I when I'm working abroad, the the power of invitation, because you go to certain different areas. So great example of this. So I went to Asia and spoke at a conference in September or October. First time ever in Asia, first time ever over there. And on my way over there, everybody's coaching me, right? And this is also an interesting thing. I know I have a very big personality, but I don't know if people think that I'm just stupid or what. But well, you have to be smaller, Kate. You have to use smaller, you can't be so big, you can't be so loud, you can't be so everything. And I remember, really having almost anxiety over this. Not anxiety, but I was worried about this because I didn't want to become offensive. And so when we got over there into Asia, we started interacting with folks, and folks were very warm with how I was in day-to-day interaction, so outside of the business world. And so I thought, I feel like maybe what I'm bringing in this case is probably not as offensive as people would think it is, right? And so then we were at the conference, and I was kind of wandering around, and I had met a couple of other people, Brits and whatever. And then I'm over in the room setting up for my lecture, and I looked at the partner that I was traveling with, and I said to him, "Hey," I said, "I'm just going to be myself today. Like, is that okay?" And he
Mhm.
looked at me, and in his Texas drawl, he goes, "Well, that's kind of the point." Right? And so I was like, "Oh, okay," because everybody to this point, outside of this individual, had been telling me, "Be smaller. Don't be as authentic." Because what you're bringing as this big, bold, loud Canadian is going to be offensive to this really demure, quiet, hierarchical culture.
Yeah.
It's
No,
just it was very interesting to me.
no, and I think that being authentic is one of the best things that we can do for ourselves and for in many ways for those around us. Um, so there's one concept in psychology and neuroscience called expressive suppression. Basically, if you have an emotion or a way of doing things, and for whatever reason it may not be appropriate for the present moment, you've got different choices and strategies that you can do to manage that emotion. So the most healthy one is to reinterpret the emotion, try to think, what is it telling you? What's the actions you need to do? Is there another way you can interpret things that's less distressing? Like that's the best case scenario. But a lot of people, particularly, I would say Gen X and older, they have a coping strategy that's referred to as express suppression, where you don't express that emotion, you bottle it up,
Mm,
and you
mhm.
either express it later or not at all, depending on how comfortable you are with that particular emotion. And what they found is that paradoxically, not letting that emotion be expressed results in greater stress being taken on by the body. So your sympathetic nervous system will get more activated subsequently. Your stress response system is going to be easier to turn on and potentially become a little bit more dysregulated. So paradoxically, you actually become more emotional and stressed out by suppressing your emotions than if you were to just be authentic, acknowledge that you have an emotion and process it and move on. So again, like being authentic to oneself can in many ways be a superpower. It's very good for your own personal health, but to your point, it can also have that social magnetism as well. Um, one quick, I guess, like side anecdote story. I recently got to hear Bobby Rissette, who was Canada's first Indigenous queer woman CEO, and she had
She's
an exit
amazing.
opportunity, and she was saying that when she fully started when she fully started embracing her identity and like not trying to hide it from people, again, to your point, being worried about offending people by being a little bit more loud with that identity status, she found that that's when things actually started to take off for the business. People appreciated the authenticity. They understood who she was, what she stood for, and it became a known quantity. And in many cases, it turns out people really like that known quantity and they wanted to work with that known quantity, and it became a strategic asset. So again, like being authentic to ourselves is can be really, really powerful.
Well, and with expressive depression, the other part of what that also does is you're just sitting there and you're just spinning on it, right? And so what happens, and I'm no neuroscientist, nor am I a psychologist. I kind of maybe pretend I am one on the internet. I'm kidding, I don't. But when we look at that and what it does to the actual reticular activating system, to be able to focus on just that, because when you're not expressing yourself and you're not naming it and you're not going into metacognitive cognitive state to say, this is what I'm feeling, why am I feeling this way, how can I move through and past it, even if it is just something as simple as writing it down and saying, I'll deal with this later, getting it out of your head. Like, this is not just like, this is more than the power of journaling and manifestation. This is you focusing your brain and your whole existence on the fact that you feel terrible right now. And therefore, everything else is filtered out.
Hmm. No, no, 100%. So there's a few different like broad brain networks that can be active at any given time. One of them is called the default mode network, which is the one that's active when our internal voice inside of our head is going on. Kind of when we're daydreaming, or to your point, if we're worrying about X, Y, or Z. Um, and when that is the dominant brain network that's active, it takes us out of being fully present, because again, we're like low key a little dissociated inside of our own head, and it makes it slightly more challenging to go from idea to action on the implementation
Mm.
side. Um, just because of my own flavor of neurodivergence, being able to be very thoughtful and critical, use that inside voice is one of my superpowers. But I recognize it's a double edged sword, because if I spend all my time in that particular brain state, then I'm not able to transition over to the implementation side, where it's like, just do it. Doesn't matter if it's perfect. Doesn't matter if it, got some flaws. We can iterate it later, and having something is better than nothing. So I've really been trying to be mindful, at least in my personal life, and how I um, make that transition. And yeah,
It's interesting you talk about that because that is something that's like a theme for me this week, right? When I start a new year, I always pick a word. And this year, my word is command. And command is one of my number one strengths on the Strengths Finder. It's part of my methodology and just how I do things, right? People don't come to a consultant who doesn't get stuff done.
yeah,
That's really just, I mean, what am I consulting with you about if you're not actually going to implement something? And it's interesting because we were at the firm, the firm that I'm at, we're young ish still. Like, I would say that we're inside of 5 years, so we're still in that startup phase, and so we're building systems and processes and stuff like that, and we're still serving clients. It's a lot of moving pieces, and that's what I like. I like that diversity because I'm very much about, let's find some things to do and then let's build them and then hand them off to the right people to get them done. And I
yes.
built this marketing strategy in December, and I have this marketing action team, and it's full of thoroughbreds. Like, they're ready to get out of the gate. And I've had to bridle a couple of these Gen Zs who are on there because they're ready to just like light up Twitter. And I'm like, okay, well, can we get LinkedIn moving properly first? That would be great.
Yeah.
But it was interesting because we had a conversation this week and I handed off the marketing strategy to them and I said to them, I'm done talking. You now have the strategy. It's been approved by one of the other managing directors and had feedback from this other managing director and a partner. Now you have it. Link your plans to the strategy, make sure they're in alignment, and go. I'm done talking. I'm ready to do. Right. Because for me, I look at it like I don't want perfect to be the enemy of good 100% of the time. And that's really
Yeah.
what you're talking about is if we're sitting in this default mode network and we're just thinking, those are the times when you're in analysis by paralysis. We're allowing perfect to be the enemy of good. We're not looking at the opportunity for continuous improvement because we're looking for first time perfection.
Hmm. No, 100%. And again, like, I mean, getting something out with the ability to iterate
Hmm.
is a much better strategy to getting excellence. It was in grad school that I really had to distinguish between perfect and excellent. Like, excellence is something that I always strive for, but perfection
Yes,
is a statistical concept that doesn't exist in reality. So striving for it usually is counterproductive.
I agree. And I think, for me personally, striving for perfection has always been a very significant part of who I am. And I've worked on that for years to get to the point where I'm at now, because when you combine the stride for perfection together with the desire to be authentic, those two naturally are like opposite magnets. They don't go together, because if you're trying to be authentic, there is absolutely zero possibility of you being perfect.
No, 100%. And I think that was something that it took a long time for me to internalize and properly figure out is that, yeah, perfect and authentic don't really work well together, but authentic and excellence can work well together. Um, and part of the way that I try to be authentic and have that sense of excellence is knowing that again, as somebody that has ADHD, like my mind's going to go in many different places and I can, go off on tangents, but that undysregulated version of myself is not necessarily the most excellent version of myself. And
Hmm.
being able to be present and be a little bit more measured in the way that I'm engaging with other people is still very authentic to me. In that sense, but that allows me to reconcile those two goals. So it's not about being perfect and making no mistakes. It's all about just being regulated enough that I can smoothen out some of the hard edges of my neurodiversity to present that excellence. Because fundamentally, that's what I'm striving for. And it doesn't mean that the mistakes are bad, they're just part of the process. And if anything, they can be features, not a bug.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. The part
Yeah.
of the features and not the bug.
No, I think that's honestly something that's really underappreciated, and I'm really glad that I got those 2 years of clinical training within clinical psychology because when you get your assessment report, it should, if it's done by a good psychologist, have a list of strengths and a list of weaknesses or challenges, and then recommendations for how you can navigate those. So you can really lean into your strengths, but then have the support systems in place so that your challenges don't become too challenging. And almost everything is a double-edged sword. Take anxiety
Yes.
for instance. Most people don't want to experience anxiety. It's not a particularly pleasant emotion. And some of us are hardwired to experience anxiety more than others. Um, but I like to make the joke that I want my accountants and my lawyers to be a bit on the neurotic side because that means they're anxious about those low probability, high impact scenarios that I personally can't be bothered to think about and deal with. And that's how they keep me safe is they worry about those for me. So in this case, if someone wants to be an accountant for my company and they come across like a California surfer who's more interested in music than accounting, I'm like, bye Felicia, that's not the right personality skill set for this particular role.
Yeah. It's we talk about that in the safety world as well. Like, I do a lot of work in visible safety leadership, and we say you should actually go to bed every single night if you're leading a team of people, for example, at a refinery, and you should feel a sense of unease. You should feel uncomfortable about the fact that you left the plant that day and they were still doing a maintenance project, and you have, it just that sense of unease is not about me wishing anxiety or discomfort on somebody, but it's enough to know that you realize that what you have is a very high risk role, and being present in that high risk role and making sure that those conversations are happening is critical to the well-being of the families and the people in those roles and the environment and the communities and all of those different things.
No, I agree with most of what you just said, but I'll give a little bit of pushback in that I wouldn't want the people to actually go to bed with that sense of unease.
Yeah.
Um, and this, I guess, the issue of a burnout. So
Mm,
In relation to most of the mental health challenges that, typically we would discuss, they're emotion based. So there's an emotion that you don't want to experience or that you're avoiding, and those sorts of things. And that kind of shapes your actions. And in order to manage your mental health conditions effectively, you basically have to be brave and put yourself in the situation to feel that emotion in order to learn that it's not as bad as you may have thought, and that in fact you can manage those situations, whatever they may be. And sometimes you might need a little bit of support. That's okay. But burnout is fundamentally different. It is hormone based, not emotion based. So when it comes to burnout, you actually have to pause and rest and allow your body to recover in order to get back to a place of being unburnt out. So there's a fairly strong analogy with a fitness, since I think a lot of your audience is really into physical fitness in that sense. Um, so to use your example, this refinery manager, he shows up and let's say he's got a 10-hour day in which he's, doing the work. During that period of time, he's going to be stressed out. He's going to be fully present, really engaged. And that's going to take a bit of a physical toll on his body. That is 10 hours potentially of his amygdala saying, hey, be worried. Hey, be worried. And his
mm,
stress response system, his HPA axis, his cortisol, and all the steroid hormones, more or less being told that they need to be shooting up, or whether or not there's directly a need for that. And the only way to rebalance your hormone system is to give it a rest. Give your brain some time to feel like it's not in danger, like it doesn't need to be on edge, like it has that sense of safety and it's safe to relax. Eat some food, digest it properly, spend some time with loved ones, and all that. And it's in those periods of rest that your stress response system is able to recalibrate in order to be uh, more precise in how it gets used the next day as a proper asset. Whereas if you, again, if the site manager were to go to bed with unease, then it's going to start impacting his sleep, and you're literally not going to get that opportunity for the rest and recovery that your brain needs to function at its best. In the same way that muscles that are worked out during the day need to rest at night and on the rest day in order to properly recover and become stronger. So there's a strong parallel there.
yes, absolutely. And I guess to clarify, I would never wish anybody to go home and think about work. But I think what the point is that the unease is when you have the responsibility, are you as a leader in those 10 hours when you're there, present, doing the right things, preparing other people to take that shift that you trust? And I think the unease never actually goes away when you're responsible for something as high risk as that. So we use that as an example to say we want you to have a level of unease because that discomfort means that you're going to make and take the actions to ensure that those things are turned off. Now, what you are talking about is exactly what we do see. But what's interesting in where I'm seeing burnout is I'm not necessarily seeing burnout in those high risk industries. I'm seeing burnout in technology. I'm seeing burnout in sales. I'm seeing burnout with people who are in the crosshairs of what we would generally classify to be white collar workforce. And in a lot of cases, the work that they're doing and the things that they're participating in are not life or death. Like you're 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 gathering requirements for an IT system. But you know what I think the trigger points are for people is if I don't perform this well, or if I don't work as hard as the person who's on email at 11 o'clock at night, I become dispensable.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying there. Again, if you kind of take like the blue collar work place, a lot of times that involves you actually have to physically go to a job site and you're present, you're working, you're doing the work there. It can be really stressful, but then critically, you leave the job site and you go back home. And if there's any physical labor involved, you're probably tired, so your body naturally will slip into that rest and relaxation mode a lot easier in that kind of a cycle and an environment. Whether or not you're getting enough rest, that's an objective question, but at least like there's the right raw ingredients for that burnout cycle, the stress response cycle to happen properly. Whereas with a lot of more white collar work, you don't necessarily get that opportunity for rest. As you pointed out, if you're not doing something until 11 o'clock at night or, those sorts of things, again, there's the perception that you're not working hard enough, or as you said, you might be dispensable. And as a result, you don't get the psychological space safety to turn off. Or
Mm.
if you do turn off, you feel guilty about it, which compromises the rest that you're trying to get. So in that case, I would say it's a work-life balance issue where there's not the same kind of boundaries between your rest and your work-related spaces of life compared to more of a blue-collar role where that it's a little bit more explicit. And as a result, the white-collar people aren't getting the opportunities for rest. So then that stress response dysfunction in the hormone system just keeps accumulating until you get some sort of a breakdown and people need to take a stress leave, which is very expensive for companies.
Very, yeah. And I think the other part of that too is the fact that where we've got this hybrid or this remote work culture that came about through COVID. And it's very, very interesting to me. Gen Z depends on kind of which end of Gen Z they are. Like my daughter is 21 and she works for the same firm that I do. And she has made it explicitly clear that she has no intent of putting her Outlook email app or her Teams app on her phone. She's not compensated for that. And when she is on, she's on. And when she's off, she's off. And so I think what she sees though, as a managing director, here I am. I got home from the gym this morning just before we jumped on the line, and I received an email from a partner saying, okay, well, we have a meeting on Monday afternoon, and here's the homework I want everybody who is going to be in this meeting to do. And it's like, okay, well, it's, 12 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. I have to pack to travel for a month. I'm traveling with my wife tomorrow. And then from there, it's going to be, I'm in meetings, I think, from 8 o'clock all the way through until the time of this meeting. So when is it that I'm expected to do that work? Well, I'm expected to do that work while I'm on the plane. It's irrelevant when I'm expected to do that work. I'm
Yeah.
just expected to do that work. And that's not a slight to the partner. It is what it is at being at an executive level of an
Yeah,
organization,
it's corporate hustle culture.
right? But it's also not the way that Canadians tend to work. It's an American culture. As a Canadian, I'm receiving that, and it's like, okay, I understand. Now, of course, it's business development in a market that I'm not really that busy in, so it's a very light lift for me at the end of the day. But it just speaks, I think, to that very point that you were just making, is that as a white collar workforce, we just simply don't necessarily have the same latitude to leave the work at work.
hmm No, and that's why it becomes very important for people to push those boundaries, much like I think you said your daughter was.
Yeah.
Um, some of the work that we've done looking at burnout in relation to different personality neurodiversity factors, we found that compassion related burnout is one of the biggest challenges that is often faced. So if you think about a lot of people in healthcare and the nonprofit sector, you tend to get a lot of people that are very high in the agreeableness trait, which you can think about as like a social lubricant. We're having an interaction right now, and I want to put in effort to make sure that you have a positive experience socially interacting with me. Which is good. That helps out in a lot of different ways. Women tend to be higher on this particular trait than men on average, although there's always variability. But if that trait is too high, then you get into the case of this white collar burnout scenario where you're being
Yeah.
asked to do something and you don't feel comfortable holding a boundary and saying no for my personal health and needs. I can't or shouldn't do that. And instead, you do it anyway and further exacerbate that hormonal dysregulation. So, as a result, feeling comfortable to say no to the workplace in thoughtful, appropriate ways is a really key thing for managing that burnout. And yeah, certain sectors, certain types of people, certain cultures can be at different levels of risk for that. Um, and then just going back one tangent, I think in Canada, one thing that we uniquely are very skilled at is recognizing that we have a very diverse workforce. And by
Truly.
extension, what works for one person isn't going to work for another person for any number of reasons. So you kind of need to have a more thoughtful, comprehensive approach with a little bit of variability and leniency baked in, and that's how appease a multi-generational, multicultural approach to doing work in general. So in Canada, I think we intuitively get that a little bit more. I like to say
Yeah.
that diversity, equity, and inclusion in the United States is basically it's a checkbox for investors to say, like, yes, we're doing good things, and it's very performative. You do those kinds of things, and there's not this. It doesn't necessarily have that emphasis on the follow through. It's very for the checkbox. Whereas in Canada, like, the immigrant story is much closer to most of our families, generationally, than it is in many places in the U.S. So as a result, we genuinely have empathy for the cultural or the racial minority group, because that was our family a generation or two ago, so we want them to have the same opportunities. So as a result, I think we just have a little bit more genuine goodwill for how we approach embracing diversity, in that regard. And it's also
And
enshrined in a lot of our legal policy, in terms of employment laws in a number of different ways. Again, like, we really kind of stand out in how we try to integrate that more diverse workforce, however you want to chop up diversity.
we do. And in you're kind of tapping a little bit on one of the other areas that I've been spending a lot of time on in both research and application, which is psychological safety, creating that psychological safety in the workforce to be able to say, actually, you know what, I'm not going to work on weekends. I am going to have a boundary. And that becomes very difficult, particularly when you're looking down economic boundaries and people feel like, hey, if I don't do this, or I'm a contractor, I'm a new hire, I need to fit in. And the psychological safety aspect is a really interesting area in that it links into the trust equation. So I don't know if you're familiar with the trust equation, but it is, credibility plus reliability plus intimate connection, all valued over your own self orientation. And those are things that you show up, you do, you exhibit. And, I think about it and where the breakdown happens currently, based off of the pace of business, the disconnected workforce, the at-home remote hybrid workforce that we have, where we're not actually interacting face to face a lot of the time, is
Yeah.
is in the intimate connection. And when I looked at that through the research of my book, what I've done is I've actually created a secondary engagement model that goes around that. And it comes down to psychological safety. Do I feel safe enough to truly be
Mhm.
emotionally
Authentic.
connected to somebody?
Yeah,
The
stay
the
up to your
secondary
authentic self.
Exactly, your authentic self. Do I feel psychologically safe to be who I actually am? The second piece to that is presence. And I often tell people that the best, worst thing that was ever invented is this little talk box. For those of you who are listening, I'm holding up my phone because I'm absolutely listening. Please go on. Yeah, no, you can't multitask. Your brain doesn't work like that, right? And then the third piece is resonance, particularly when it comes down to leadership, where you hold space for people as opposed to creating spotlight for yourself. So once again, we're taking those things and we're putting it all over our own self-orientation. If I'm leading you and creating a psychologically safe space, and then we have intimate connection, and my orientation, my self-orientation is not important because I'm focused on you. The ability for you to say, you know what, I actually have my kid's birthday party, or we're going to go do these things today. I'm not gonna be working, or I'm not gonna have my work applications on my personal phone. It should be okay.
Yeah. No, I really like that, and I think, going back to that idea of, like, psychological safety, and I like that you brought in leaders, because within any organization, leaders have a very disproportionate influence in how things tend to go. So as a result, if a leader, for whatever reason, understands the concept of psychological safety, understands how to curate it for themselves, and they're not
Mhm.
so self-centered that they know how to then do that curation for other people, namely their employees, that's how you get that more institutional grade psychological safety. So I completely agree with that, and I like that you brought in the presence piece as well. Because if you, despite all the best things, if you're not actually present, then a lot of it doesn't matter because you're not receiving all the information, all the cues that in fact this is a safe space, potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you see it too, like when you get out there, and I always apply it to like the coaching industry, right? Because the coaching industry is one that is very much we're there for other people. But when you look at it, whether it's a life coach, a health coach, a bodybuilding coach, a business coach, oftentimes what you see is they make this spotlight about them, my client testimonial, and this I did for this person. Like you go on LinkedIn and you see these people and they're promoting themselves but using somebody else's story or the interaction of what good they did to be able to drive their own image higher. And for me, that just kills any psychological safety that I'd have with that person, because what it tells me is it's more important for them to be successful and that I'm a means to their end.
Mhm. Oh, I hadn't thought about it quite that way, but yeah, no, I actually really agree, now that you phrased it in that particular way. Um, Yeah, no, I think that mentorship is absolutely critical. And I think coaching can be a form of mentorship. So I think there's a lot of value there. But you have to find the right coaching relationship. In clinical psychology, we call that the therapeutic alliance. In your trust equation, that would be the resonance piece. Making sure that there's enough value and process alignment that you and whoever's doing the coach can effectively work together. And yeah, I can see why being treated as a commodity in as a coaching client could be a bit of a turnoff in that regard.
Yeah, it's just it's something that I notice. I notice it on LinkedIn, I see it on Instagram, and for me, people don't know who I coach because it's nobody's business. My
Hmm.
wins speak for themselves, right? And I think, but that comes through self-confidence, right? And when we look at those pillars of resiliency, self-confidence is one of those things that I think a lot of people lack, but they pretend to have. Because when people are self-confident, they have good relationships with them. The internal dialogue is good. They have progressive, I mean, let's be honest. I talk to a therapist once a week. The reason my internal dialogue is clean is because I have a hygiene program for it, so that I'm self-aware of that. But that's a choice,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
You can't pour from an empty cup, right? Like, what was it? I think it was Abe Lincoln said, if you give me 6 hours to cut down a tree, I'll spend the first four sharpening the axe.
Yeah. No,
Self-care
no,
is super
100%.
important.
Yeah, and I take a lot of actually inspiration from indigenous perspectives with the medicine wheel and making sure that you have to hit all four corners of the medicine wheel. So, you
Yes,
have to take care of your body, you have to take care of your mind, you have to take care of your social connections. And the piece that it often gets missed is, your spiritual health as well. Do you feel like you have
absolutely.
a sense of meaning in, the broader ecosystem and whatever spirituality may look like for any given person? But making sure that you're actually attending to all four of those things, I think is really, and that there's a balance is really important. Otherwise we get stuck in focusing on just one of those things to the exclusion of others.
Yeah, and when you have people who are neurodivergent, and ADHD is a great example of where somebody can hyper focus on something. So I'm going to hyper focus only on my mental health and my well-being, and so everything that you have goes into just mental health and well-being. Well, now your sleep is languishing, your nutrition is languishing, your connections with family or friends are languishing, because you're not looking around at the holistic point of the fact that we are beings made up of so many different elements, and we have different needs in each one of those quadrants.
No, 100%. So yeah, you definitely have to make sure that you're attending to all those different needs, and that way as an individual, you're taken care of, your needs are addressed. And then once you get that baseline, that's when you can properly become a leader and start taking care of other people, not because you need to or you feel a compulsion to or trying to distract yourself from your own
Yeah.
challenges, but because it's something that you have the capacity to do, and you can put the boundaries around it so that it's net positive for everyone involved.
That's absolutely great advice. So now this seems like a good spot to hit the pause button. I don't want to hit the end button with you, Dr. Ty, because I think that there's a lot here that we could continue to unpack. So first off, if people want to get in touch with you, they want to follow your journey, they want to see your research, where can they find you?
So there's a few different places. My company's name is 8-Bit Cortex, number 8, BITCORTEX. So you can find us on Instagram and LinkedIn. So if you want to learn more about the burnout management work that we're doing, how we incorporate neurodiversity into that, or how we're helping innovative companies and nonprofits do a better job of demonstrating the economic value of their programs and their initiatives. Um, uh, you can check us out there. Um, if you want to just send a straight up email, it's info@8bitcortex.com. And I would recommend following on social media. We try to do at least once a quarter, we're trying to get up to once a month, a Brains and Brew event, where basically we're just trying to bring people from the community together in a very non formal, chill setting, typically over a beer or a coffee. And we just talk about some of these neuroscience ideas as they relate to different areas of application. So, for example, burnout management in the corporate space, or why psychedelics can be beneficial for addiction recovery. Or we're going to be doing one up and coming on how sleep is actually your secret weapon for burnout management. So if you follow us on there, then you'll be able to be aware when those events are happening and able to attend them if you'd like. And then as well, my personal handle is Ty the Neuro Guy, and I'm also on LinkedIn and Instagram as well. Um, and more or less, in addition to the change management, the organizational level stuff that my company does, I also do a little bit of coaching as well. And just more broadly, I'm interested in connecting with people and seeing where there may be opportunities for collaboration. I'm always shocked by the random conversation I have that becomes relevant 3 to 6 months in the future, when suddenly now the stars are aligning for a collaboration to really be truly win-win. So I've always tried to make as much time for just being able to connect with people here and there as I can. So if you want to connect with me by email, it would be ty@8bitcortex.com. So yeah, I think that covers the services and events that myself and my company offer. And we're building technology as well that I don't think we have enough time to get into. So perhaps that might be a future one. But the TLDR is we want to take those processes and make sure that they're data driven, and as much as possible that the journey of healing is revenue positive for all stakeholders involved, because what
Mhm.
is better than growing our businesses, growing our economy while we're becoming the best versions of ourselves, and finding the organizations that do that effectively and making sure that they've got the resources to keep doing that sustainably.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Well, Ty, I see us having another conversation, maybe two in the future. I'd love to have you back on just a Q&A episode where we can get some questions from all of our listeners and from our community and bring them back. I'd love to hear more about the technology side of what you're doing, but I think the things that you're doing are groundbreaking, and I think it's what our world needs. We need the data to support how we actually feel, because some of us just need the data.
Yeah. No, I think that a lot of us have a love hate relationship with data in the sense that we know that it's important. We're excited for it to tell us a story that we want to hear, but we're scared that it might tell us a story that we don't want to hear. So there's some ambivalence.
Mm.
Whereas I'm a really firm believer in, like, the data is the data. Like, I mean, I'm wrong most of the time. I feel very comfortable saying that from my scientific training. And the data is the opportunity you have to be smarter tomorrow, to be slightly less wrong tomorrow. And yeah, so it's always just a question of how can you use as many different sources of data and insight to help achieve your goals, and not being scared of those things. Um, yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Ty, for taking your time on a Saturday morning to sit down and record with me. This will release in a couple of weeks. I don't know where in the world I'll be, but I know that it's going to be well received. And so I really appreciate your time and your insights and what you've chosen to share with us today.
Awesome. Well, very good luck on your travels. And when you get back to Calgary, we'll have to have you out to Brains and Brew so we can talk about these things in person with a broader group setting over a nice brewski.
That sounds wonderful. Wonderful. And listeners, thank you for joining us today. All of Ty's contact information will be in the show notes, so you'll be able to pick those up and connect with him. And remember, protect your peace, chase your dreams, and stay unbreakable.